You can't talk about U.S. imports or U.S. trade without talking about China. And of course, one thing that we've noticed, Joe and Alex, is that offshore Yuan steadily depreciating throughout trading today, which is curious. And I'll go back to my point earlier today, which is you don't usually see a lot of movement in FX on late Friday afternoons. The Tokyo and London FX desks have already cleared out for the weekend. So I find it curious that the offshore Yuan continue to depreciate in value.
Do you see further pressure? Where does China stand right now with the valuation of its currency from your perspective? There was a lot of talk about that last August. There was a lot of talk about that earlier this year. It's kind of gone quiet, but as you see that offshore currency weakening, do you think we're going to start talking again about whether China will have to devalue?
I think it's really critical to differentiate between how China's currency moves against the dollar and how it moves against a broader basket of currencies. I would think that some of the move is a reflection of the fact that, on the Brexit news, the dollar strengthened a bit against the euro. And since China is increasingly managing against a basket, you can imagine that leading to some weakness. I think the bigger question is whether China can control expectations. During the period of intense pressures last August, September, and again this fall, the widespread expectation of a depreciation against the dollar, in my view, far more than concerns about the banking system, led to an acceleration in capital outflows. Those flows have clearly dropped. There's not as much money moving out. Pressure on the currency has gone down. But as the yuan tests some of the levels of January against the dollar, you could imagine that it might be more difficult to manage.
And you take a look at, say, what's happening offshore versus onshore, and that's painting an interesting picture as well. Take a look at the Bloomberg here. This white line is the offshore dollar yuan, so as it rises, the yuan is falling, and the blue line is the onshore. When we've seen those divergence in the past, the purple line is the Shanghai Composite. Back in August, boom, Shanghai Composite had a big sell-off, and back in January, the Shanghai Composite also had a sell-off. Do you expect something similar to play out here if that band continues to widen?
I mean, I do think that the differential is a good measure of the direction of market pressure. And by market pressure, in this case, kind of hedge fund speculative pressure. It is an important signal for Chinese companies because Chinese companies are the ones who really have the capacity to move money in and out of China. But I think for the Shanghai Composite, what really matters far more than the differential, admittedly there's a correlation, is the future path of Chinese growth.
Brad, you worked for Treasury from 2011 to 2015. You worked on the European debt crisis. What do you think investors learned from that experience that might inform them on how China's debt buildup may play out over the next couple of years?
I'm not entirely convinced there's a precise analogy between the euro area crisis and China's crisis. The euro area crisis was a crisis of, say, a monetary union that wasn't a full monetary union, where there were deep doubts about whether the ECB would stand behind, indirectly, of course, Italian, Spanish, other bonds. And that led to a widening between the Bund and the